We are live.
All right, welcome everyone to Connected Learning TV. This is the second webinar in our two-part May 2016 series titled Building News Literacy, Critical Media Skills, and Political Awareness Today, which was organized by the News Literacy Project. If you're watching this, please take a moment to share it with your networks. I'm Peter Adams, SVP of Education Programs at the News Literacy Project, and I'll be your host today. And I'm talking with Chris Fusco and Tim Novak from the Chicago Sun-Times, both investigative reporters there, about the power of investigative journalism and how young people can also become watchdogs and build their assessment skills when it comes to news, politics, and information. Before we dive into the conversation, though, let's go over a couple of quick details. To those of you watching right now, we welcome your comments and questions through either the Twitter hashtags Connected Learning or hashtag 2 next prez with a Z, or through the Q&A feature that you should see within the video player. And we'll do our best to address your questions here in the Hangout. This webinar is also being co-streamed at the National Writing Project's educatorinnovator.org site and is part of a series of programming related to Letters to the Next President 2.0, which engages and connects young people ages 13 to 18 as they research, write, and make media to voice their opinions on issues that matter to them in the coming election, hence the hashtag 2 next prez. This webinar will be available as a resource on letterstopresident.org, where you can find many other resources and opportunities related to the election, writing, and digital literacies. With that out of the way, let's give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. Chris, do you want to start us off?
Sure. My name is Chris Fusco. I've been at the Sun-Times nearly 16 years. What kind of got me into investigative reporting was covering state government during the Blagojevich years, former Governor Rod Blagojevich, who now is in prison. And it kind of led me to work with Tim a little bit, doing stories about a key Blagojevich fundraiser named Tony Rezko, who also had a pretty large intersection with the Obama campaign. So that got Tim and I working together, and he's been my mentor and my friend for years.
Great. Tim?
My name is Tim. I've been here a little over 20 years. I believe that doing your own stories is a lot better than having someone assign stories to you, so I've gravitated to this kind of work because it allows us a great deal of freedom to pursue things we would like to pursue and chase things that we think are interesting and important to chase. Probably the biggest thing I've done here, one of the biggest things I've done here is about a dozen years ago, I uncovered a $40 million a year program in which the city was hiring trucks that were doing nothing, and the companies were making donations to people and who made the decisions on what trucks to hire, and there were mob people running the companies, et cetera, et cetera. So that story kind of allowed me complete freedom at that point.
Great. So yeah, a little bit there from both of you about what kind of hooked you on investigative reporting and what makes it different. I think we'll return to that a little bit in a moment. But to help students understand, so we're being joined, as you both know, by students across the country who may or may not know much about investigative reporting and what it involves. And so I thought we would take a look at some of your recent work to try to highlight something that's called the Watchdog Role, which is a common term that people use to describe investigative journalism and other types of reporting and journalism, but especially investigative work. A recent story you did earlier this month about the governor here in Illinois and the House Speaker, Michael Madigan, who are bitter political rivals but have some interesting business connections. Madigan's law firm has helped businesses that Rouners invested in minimize their taxes and yet in the political arena they are bitter enemies. You have done a number of stories on the Chicago Housing Authority, which is the city agency that oversees public housing here in Chicago, about landlords that abuse the voucher system, that make a great deal of money, renting out apartments that may or may not be up to code for voucher money, which is basically guaranteed public money to them. Some CHA residents are able to use vouchers to rent apartments in luxury high-rises. You did a story about this and the sort of political connections that led to that. You did a story about another story here about units that are part of the voucher program, and a building that was developed by politically connected folks. A story about wait lists and how confusing the waitlisting system with CHA can be. Some residents wait a long time, some residents get units right away, and some other pieces about the Chicago Transit Authority and the pension system there, and the abuse of pensions, people overlapping pensions, people paying up to boost their pension in a way that actually results in more public money being spent as well. And some of your stories you've done in partnership with the BGA, which we'll talk about here in a minute, but I wanted to stop there and sort of highlight those stories to draw attention to the Watchdog Role, because it's such a central part of our conversation here. And basically, the press is able to act as a watchdog on the public's interest on stories like these in a way that government is not able to always police itself. You both spoke a little bit at the opening about how that freedom sort of attracted you to investigative journalism. Either of you have anything to add there in terms of how you would define the watchdog role, or the way you play it, or why it's so vital?
We call Tim the alpha watchdog, so I'll let him answer that. I'll let him answer that first.
So Tim, why do we need journalists to play this role? Why can't government watchdog itself, or companies watchdog themselves?
Well, they try to, or at least they claim to. They hire people like inspectors general, or they have auditors. In a lot of cases, those things don't become public. For instance, the CHA, the Chicago Housing Authority, has an auditor and an inspector general whose reports are not public. So whatever they find, no one knows. So you need someone to, the media was set up as a check and balance on the government under the Constitution. So this is probably the most fundamental role that a newspaper can play.
Great, yes, and the First Amendment's protection of press and speech both sort of play into that role and support that role. And let's talk about the Sun-Times partnership with the BGA, which is the Better Government Association. A number of your stories on the site, if students and teachers go there and search up your names and take a look at your work, they'll see in the byline a mention sometimes of a partnership with the BGA. Can one of you maybe explain just briefly what that partnership is about and what the BGA is?
Sure. I mean, given the media landscape, we're all trying to do more with less. Advertising revenue is down. We're all trying to find kind of this magic solution to make the industry prosper again like it did. And part of that is the Better Government Association is a decades-old organization that has been keeping an eye on government. It has kind of a journalism branch. It also has kind of a good government advocacy branch that tries to impact public policy. But our relationship with them is on the journalism side, obviously, and they do not-for-profit fundraising. Another group kind of nationally that's gotten a foothold is Propublica. The Better Government Association is kind of like a local Propublica. And actually, some of our colleagues, former colleagues at the Sun-Times, now work there, so it's a natural fit for us. They can do Freedom of Information Act requests, which we're going to talk about more later on. We work in concert with them trying to gather data. Once data comes in, I know hopefully some of your students have seen the movie Spotlight, the scene where they're inputting into a spreadsheet. That's a lot of what happens in this room. and it's a lot of what we do with the BGA is creating spreadsheets, creating data, and they have the resources to do that, and it's very helpful to us to have them as a partner on a lot of these stories.
Right. And
it's a partnership that has existed for decades. You know, in the early 70s, the Sun-Times and the BGA actually bought a bar and ran a bar for a month, in which city building inspectors would come by and seek bribes to overlook building code violations, fire code violations. So it's a partnership that does have a long history to it.
So open to business as a basis to do a story and do an investigation firsthand.
Yeah, it was a very controversial thing, but yeah.
Right.
Got the job done, though.
Right.
A lot of people got in trouble.
So when you both introduced yourselves, you mentioned the freedom that you have and how that attracts you to investigative work, and Tim mentioned no one gives you your stories, no one assigns you your stories per se, the way you might as a general assignment reporter or working on another desk in the newsroom, where an editor might say, here's a story I want you to go cover. Can you maybe, for students who aren't aware, sort of help explain how an investigative unit works and where it fits in the newsroom and why that's important?
You know, we're part of, in our room there's 4 people in here. We all kind of work together. We are kind of the longer term guys, although we kind of operate, we're investigative reporters, but we, I think, put a certain degree of pressure on ourselves to produce. We have at least one thing a week in the paper, if not 2 or 3. We always kind of, Tim describes it as, we've got those 4 burners on the stove. Things are always in various stages of cooking, and sometimes things need to cook a little longer, so you're doing a faster story and trying to get that out. So we're not day-to-day people, although we do, once we launch a story, any follow-up, stories can become kind of their own beats. Just as Grant Spielman covers City Hall, the story we'll talk about later on with the David Cashman case has become Tim and I's beat, and there are daily stories that we have to do off that beat. So kind of how we operate.
And the stories you tend to cover are sometimes enormously complex, and as you mentioned, take a long time to report or to even be ready to publish the initial report to conclude the investigation.
Right, and we always try to get, I think a key part of what we do is we try to get results. And it's not always getting somebody indicted or sending them to prison, but it's also trying to impact public policy. That milk money story, that BGA story, that raised awareness about this family that was landing all kinds of contracts, from the school milk contract to electrical contracts, and they eventually, one of their businesses was had its minority women-owned certification rescinded based on the awareness we raised about what was going on there. So when we go into a story, we're not going into it saying, oh, we want X result, but we're aware that if we're going in that there are probably going to be more stories to do if we do our jobs the way we've done them in the past. So.
Right. And in this milk money story, you found a discrepancy in pricing between CPS and other districts that this milk delivery company services. And what seems like a relatively small amount, like a penny difference per unit per carton of milk, adds up to huge amounts of money. I think $700,000 in this case, correct? And that's public money and obviously really important. And I think that is a perfect example of playing the watchdog role on behalf of the public. Most members of the public would have no way of knowing how much CPS is paying for milk compared to other townships and suburbs and clients, and surfacing that obviously is very relevant to taxpayers who are funding the schools, and that's where the money is in part going. So a perfect example there. So let's pivot into, you mentioned the David Cashman series, and this is something that really became your beat, and the Sun-Times has dedicated an entire section of the site. I'm going to show the site, and maybe one or both of you could just briefly explain what this story is about, and how it came about, and what it turned into. And I'll just sort of click through some of the visuals here as you narrate, if that's okay.
About in 2004, this young man who had turned 21 went out with his friends to a very popular part of Chicago where people go to bars, and he got into an argument, and someone punched him in the face. He fell back and hit his head, and he died a couple of weeks later. The person who punched him ran away and was never charged. At the time, it had come out that one of the people who had some involvement in that incident was the nephew of Mayor Daley. There was a lineup held. No charges were filed, and the case disappeared. And I think shortly before Mayor Daley left office in 2011,
Yes.
Chris and I decided that we were looking to see if there were any stories that needed to be done before he left office. So we asked to see the file on this case. And
yeah, we asked to see the file on the case, and we were told the case was still under investigation, which was very surprising to us, given that the police superintendent, Mayor Daley's police superintendent in 2004 at the time, indicated in all likelihood it was closed. From that point on in 2011, it's really been, nearly 200, maybe more than 200 stories later. The police reinvestigated, closed the case, claiming that Mayor Daley's nephew acted in self-defense. We saw things in the police report that didn't square with statements that David Cashman's friends had made to us about things that had happened that night. We didn't get all the records we had asked for. We had discovered that files were lost and had gone missing. And all of the questions we had raised, we were able to finally obtain the lineup pictures, which showed how the mayor's nephew, who's a former college football player, kind of a hulking guy at about 6'3", 220 pounds, looked small in the lineup. He did not look small on the street at all that night. It all led to the appointment of a special prosecutor, and eventually, in January of 2014, nearly 10 years after David Cashman was punched, Mayor Daley's nephew, Richard J. Vaneco, pleaded guilty to the crime. That's a big part of the story, but the part of the story that still, I think, vexes Tim and I and keeps us motivated to do the story is that while Vaneco was held accountable, the people in the system that twice investigated this case and didn't charge him really haven't been held accountable. There have been some firings that just took place in the past few months of cops who reinvestigated the case in 2011, but as far as criminal charges against those other folks, that hasn't happened. So that's kind of Cashman 101, Peter. I'm sure you have other questions, so we'll kind of let you direct us from here.
Sure. Thank you for that rundown. I know it's a huge story, very complex, and as you said, some 200 stories or reports published about this one story. Is that correct?
Just about, yeah.
Yeah. So they're all here in the special section of the site. I noticed, at the bottom you have a section where you have a searchable database of documents, and I would assume that this database is full of documents that you and Tim gathered in your reporting, right? And I wondered if one of you could talk about the role that documents play in investigative reporting, particularly. All journalists work with documents and seek documents, and then maybe talk about how you acquired these documents and why you shared them this way on the site in raw form.
Most of the documents there are police reports on this case. Many of them that were created after we began asking to see the files. So they're police reports prompted by our reporting. There's also court documents and legal filings from the from the criminal case that was brought against the mayor's nephew. All of the police reports were obtained under the Illinois Freedom of Information Act. They mostly came in some sort of redacted form, and it was a redacted police report that we obtained in 2011 that prompted us to pursue the story, because the police report had redacted, the police had basically redacted the entire report, saying that we couldn't read it because it was under investigation. So as a result, we basically had to conduct our own police investigation of the crime ourselves. So by the time we finished our investigation and began publishing stories, the police department suddenly closed their case, and then slowly began releasing documents to us, in which case the documents, their investigation and our investigation had different results.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, the documents, it seemed like with every batch of documents they released to us under the Freedom of Information Act, it only raised more questions in our minds. And Tim was the lead FOIA agent here. I mean, Tim's great about keeping track of everything, and I've got to get better and all that stuff. I tend to do it electronically using my Gmail and give every Freedom of Information Act request the same subject line and track them that way. Tim does it the old-fashioned way on his paper calendar, but on a given week, we probably, each of us files probably at least 4 to 5 open records requests a week, and you have to keep track of them, and they're all on different stories, so it's, it's part of what we do. It's the core of what we do is file FOIAs.
So just to highlight a couple of things here, Tim used the word redacted. I want to make sure students watching know what a redacted police report or document might look like. So something that's been redacted has been blacked out. As you can see on my screen here, I'm sharing a police report or a supplemental report with the date of birth of Cashman's date of birth and his address, as well as Vaneko's date of birth and address. This is not probably the level of redaction you saw in the initial reports, where I think Tim said most of the entire report was redacted and unavailable. But I wanted to make sure students understood that those initial reports were coming back mostly blacked out and really not giving you the information you sought when you filed the FOIA. The other thing I want to make sure students understand is what a Freedom of Information Act request is, and why you need it, why it's such a vital tool for journalists. So I don't know if you had any comments about redacting and the amount of information that was redacted. I just wanted to make sure students understood that. My real question here is about FOIAs. What is a FOIA, and why do you need it? Why can't you just go down to City Hall or to the department that you need, the police department, and say, I'd like a copy of this, please, and they hand it to you?
Because it doesn't work that way, and it really never has. Before the Freedom of Information Acts became law in states around the country, and even with the federal government, it was hit or miss as to whether someone would ever give you a document or whether a document existed or whatnot. So over the years, the law has evolved and changed, and now governments pretty much won't release anything unless you actually do file a request for it. I think part of that is so that they can have some written request, so they can explain, this is why I gave that document to someone, because they asked me for it, and under the law I have to do it. So it kind of is in some reforms, in some respects it's a protection. In other cases, it's a delaying tactic, a tactic to stall the release of information until they can figure out maybe what you want or why you want it or what you can do with it. And sometimes we ask for things that are very voluminous, and it does take a while to get them. So it's not walking up to a counter and saying, "Give me this, give me that," because it just doesn't happen. It never has.
Right, and the rationale, for the law is that these documents are being generated by public officials and public offices funded by public tax dollars, and that the public has the right to access some of those documents. Obviously, documents with sensitive information, personal information, things that relate to national security at the federal level won't be released or would be redacted. And obviously, some of the information that you sought here from the police department actually wound up damaging the police department in a variety of ways. It's public image, some of the officers and administrators at the police department, but under the law they were forced to release the documents that you sought. Not always a straightforward process, though, correct? They can decline a request, and you can file an appeal, and they can drag out for months frequently. Is that
right? In Illinois, your options are, if they reject you, you can appeal to the Illinois Attorney General's office, Office of Public Access Counselor. That can take months to resolve one of those cases. You also have the option of going to circuit court, and if you win in circuit court, then the public body needs to cover your legal fees. Tim and I try to operate. I think our option is we try to avoid both of those things. We will revise requests, narrow requests, file new requests, go about things in a different way to keep kind of peeling back the onion until we get what we want. That said, we do end up sometimes with the public access counselor and or going to attorneys at the Sun-Times trying to kind of pry this stuff loose. Right now we're in kind of we've been going back and forth with the BGA as a partner here and trying to pry open some of the grand jury material that was involved in the indictment of Richard J. Beneco and interviews and things of cops and prosecutors involved in the Cashman case. So it's not an exact science. It's not a one-size-fits-all policy, and we've been doing it a long time, so we kind of know what to ask for and how to go about asking it. It's not something that, as a student, I think you can go about doing without having done it for some time and having some exposure to news.
right? But that said, there's nothing to stop citizens from filing FOIAs as well, right? It's not just a tool that journalists can use. You don't have to have any sort of credentials to file a FOIA. Any citizen, any taxpayer can file a FOIA for a specific piece of information.
And in Illinois, I mean, there was a 2011 rewrite of the Open Records Law that really raised a lot of government's awareness. I mean, things like public payrolls, overtime, basic contracts. If you can be as specific as possible for what you're looking for in a FOIA request, and it's general, simple information, you should get it, and you should get it relatively quickly.
Oftentimes, those citizens ask for things that don't exist or aren't actually records or aren't public, and they may ask for them in ways that they don't understand the system, and that's understandable. But I think the citizen requests are a much more tricky procedure for governments to handle.
Right.
Their unfamiliarity with what they're asking for.
Right. It takes, I mean, I would imagine took both of you years to become familiar with different city government structures, state government institutions, and different offices and how they work and what records they do and don't keep, and what you could ask for in what ways. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So all of that, filing of FOIAs and collecting documents and entering them into spreadsheets and analyzing them and looking for discrepancies and writing and editing and publishing 200 stories is a lot of resources for the Sun-Times and both of you to put toward this one case. Why do you think this case got that much attention by both of you and the Sun-Times? Why devote that kind of those kind of resources to it? It's a very resource-intensive endeavor.
Well, for starters, it was the right thing to do. we had a roughly innocent person who lost his life on the streets of the city, and no one seemed to care how or why. And there was a strong belief that he has been killed by a member of the family that has run the city for 50 years, and that as a result, they blamed the victim for his own death. So you had an egregious wrong here. You had a situation that could happen to anybody. It's sort of a freak accident that occurred, but nevertheless it is considered a murder. And you then had a political cover-up. You had a police cover-up. You know, the cover-up. The question has always been: was the cover-up to protect the nephew or to protect the mayor? So you had a significant story that actually took us into so many different parts of the city and the state and how things work here. This case went to the police department. It went to the prosecutor's office. It went to the court system. It took us into so many different places, and it was an exercise of. It allowed us to show the public so much on how government works, not just the police department, but the politics and how deaths are investigated and how people are prosecuted and how people are charged and the mother going to court and asking for a special prosecutor to have someone with some perceived independence to review the case and determine whether or not there should be charges. It's just been a fascinating civics lesson for us and I think, for the city.
Yeah, I mean, that pretty much sums it up. I mean, it's pretty amazing to think that this murder, you know, and we're not trying to our, you know, this is what we do. We're paid to do this, but I don't think, you know, Tim got interested in this story because he worked on a story about the Daley family back in 2008, and this kind of the story of David Cashman resonated with him because he knocked on Nancy Cashman's door and said he wanted to talk to her about the case. And Nancy Cashman is a big motivator. I mean, she's a real human being, and her humanity, I think, motivated us throughout this. And when Nancy first answered the door and Tim was on the other end of it. Actually, it was a phone call. You weren't there, but she said the only thing that she told him is that the person who did it ran away, and that stuck in Tim's craw all those years, and still until we talked about trying to get the files. So it's been an emotional case and an emotional ride, and we've been criticized throughout it. The outgoing state's attorney, the now outgoing state's attorney who lost her re-election bid, was extremely publicly critical of us. Others were critical of us. I think we had a lot of doubters within our own newsroom, but the truth prevailed here, and that's pretty gratifying.
That's great. I'm struck by aspects of both of your answer there. Tim calling it a civics lesson for both of you and for the city, and hopefully for your readership and the citizens of Chicago. And Chris, in your answer there and in preparation here, you said the story took you places you never expected to go, and it really has unfolded, and you just follow the story as it unfolded. Obviously, I think the First Amendment protections of speech and press were really vital here to both of your ability to follow this story. There's some very powerful interests in the city who did not want this story to come out, you know, the ability to ask for documents, to publish stories about powerful people I think is only possible because of the First Amendment. Nonetheless, I think there were probably some real barriers. Is there an anecdote you can think of, either of you, where there was a time when someone really tried hard to silence you, to kill this story, to divert you? I'm sure it happened many times. Is there a time or two that really stands out?
Actually, that never happened.
Yeah, I mean, not within our own
Okay.
shop, but I mean,
No. I mean, a source or the police department, somebody trying to intimidate you both or the paper, didn't happen?
Not if it happened, we're unaware of it.
Okay.
And I don't really think that might there have been people in town who wished we would go away? Yeah, I'm sure there were. We've been writing this story for 5 years now. And many people thought we were overzealous and that we were blinded by our quest for the truth, which perhaps we were. And I'm sure actually we were. But we had to do all those stories to get to the truth, because if we had just written one story and gone away, well, none of this would have happened. So it was the constant pressure that we applied. You're asking if pressure was applied back, not in the way that you suggested, not any way that we've seen. We got a lot of criticism against us, but no one ever asked us to not print the story. No one ever threatened us if we did print the story.
We made a lot of people very angry. I mean, one of the elements of this story is that we drove around and went to people's homes, and the story was that important. I mean, police officers typically do not like getting visits at home, and we didn't get a lot of cooperation from them during those visits to their homes, but it was something we felt we had to do because we were leveling some pretty serious allegations here. And part of being a watchdog is we have very uncomfortable conversations with the people we write about every day, and people know who we are, and when we call, there's sometimes a recoiling preliminarily of the questions that we ask, but that's part of doing this. We're not writing about the dog show. We're not making a lot of friends doing what we do, but and we have to deal with a lot of very uncomfortable situations because of that. So this story has been really emblematic of that.
And in terms of outcomes, you mentioned that Vaneco, the mayor's nephew, who actually was eventually determined to be the guy who threw the fatal punch that night when the two groups sort of had words, was indicted. Beyond that, what were some of the other outcomes, just briefly, and then I want to move on to another story that you both worked on more recently here. But outcomes from this Cashman series, aside from the indictment.
Well, there were 6 police officers disciplined. 3 of them resigned rather than face termination. 1 was terminated. 1 is currently fighting a suspension right now.
There's 100. I mean, the special prosecutor who worked on the case produced a 162-page report that was, critical of the way the department handled the case, pointed out several of the failures. I mean, it's interesting now, given the climate in Chicago with police corruption that erupted because of the Laquan McDonald shooting. A black teenager was shot 16 times by a white cop. Now there's all kinds of stories about how the police discipline system has failed in the city, how cops get away with things. David Cashman took us into this world. I mean, some of the guys who worked on this case, one of them, a high-ranking lieutenant who retired rather than be fired, we found out he was arrested in 2004 in Michigan on a sexual abuse charge. and ended up getting a 30-day suspension for that. I don't know, that type of story now in this environment would probably be a lot more explosive. But when we were doing Cashman stories, the attitudes regarding police corruption, we were kind of the I don't know, canaries in the coal mine, for lack of a better word. And then now the story has kind of exploded. So that's how news works. There are timings and cycles, and before there was Laquan McDonald, there was David Cashman. Now, granted, the police didn't kill David Cashman, but a politically connected member of the city's first family did. So
right.
There are similarities there.
And that same machinery of police cover-up, not all police, but some police in the department that work together to alter facts or to make things difficult to investigate. So the similarity there as well, because there were those dynamics in the Laquan McDonald case, right, with disabling of body cams and
sure.
statements that didn't match up and things like that. The so-called code of silence, which you both are still writing about, obviously. So I want to pivot here, if we can, to another story, and I'm going to share this that you both did. This sort of resembles the Madigan Rauner story in that Edward Burke, who's a powerful alderman, for national viewers who aren't sure what an alderman is, I'll let one of you sort of explain what an alderman is in Chicago. But Burke is also a lawyer, has a law firm, and that firm handles property tax reduction cases, and one of his clients was Donald Trump for Trump Tower here in Chicago. So maybe one of you can talk about how you got the idea for this story, how this story came about, and quickly what it's about.
Well, an alderman in Chicago was a member of the city council. There are 50 aldermen. And Ed Burke is, without question, the most powerful of those 50 aldermen. So he's been an alderman since 1969. So he's actually been in office longer than I think anybody else in the city. When Trump came to Chicago to build this tower, he hired a bunch of local firms who are all politically connected, and then of course he hired a firm to handle his tax appeals. And in Chicago, most of those firms are run by politicians, such as Ed Burke. We have done stories on Ed Burke and his clients over the years. It's a perennial type story in that this is how he makes his living when he's not serving in the city council, and so he has all sorts of big name clients. He saves them money, they pay him money. We had never done Trump as a client since he was running for office. Since Trump is running for president, we decided that we should do this story and try to figure out how much money Ed Burke has saved Donald Trump since Trump built that tower about 10 years ago.
So basically an example of someone using political connections in their private interests, in this case Burke as a city official, perhaps leveraging that political power privately through his law firm to assist Donald Trump reduce his taxes by an astonishing amount of money, actually, which is just revenue lost to the city. Go ahead.
In many cases, it's not revenue lost to the city, because if one person gets a tax break, then the other person pays more. So the city still gets the amount of money in most cases that it wanted or needed.
Got it.
It's just a question of it's the proportionality of it. It changes the share that someone has to pay. And in your example there of your summation, it's not just Burke using his political influence. Trump is using Burke's political influence as well.
Right.
I mean, that's when people hire a firm of Ed Burke or Mike Madigan. They want their influence, so they're both trading on that influence.
Right, and in the whole system, I mean, and that's one thing that I think this story kind of pointed out. The property tax system, and as is the case with a lot of things you write about, it's extremely arcane. And you have a case here though where you have the most powerful Democratic alderman in Chicago, who appeals the taxes appeals the assessment to the Democratic Cook County assessor, who then Burke appeals them further to the Cook County Board of Review, which includes Democrats, and then he has the option, even after that, if he doesn't like the savings, he can appeal further to Cook County Circuit Court, where many of the judges are Democrats, and he slated them to be judges, and or take it to the State Property Tax Appeal Board, which is obviously under control of the Illinois legislature. So you have an extremely political system here by which this empirical analysis is being judged. So it's just an interesting process, and obviously the cherry on the sundae for us with this one is you've got Trump running as a Republican. So
Right.
he is using the whole Democratic apparatus in Chicago to reduce his tax payments on his real estate.
I assume that documents played a role here as well. Do you want to just mention quickly what your process was here in reporting this story and how you chased that down?
This was a very complicated story because of the nature of the property. Trump Tower was built on the former headquarters of the Sun-Times. So when the Sun-Times owned the building, there were two properties that made up that building, so there would be two tax bills. And during the course of construction of this tower, the two tax bills became one tax bill, and eventually became 1,500 tax bills. So we obtained, I don't even know how many records, to try to figure out all the savings that were done over the years and try to figure out what Trump owned and what he didn't own and when he owned it and when he sold it, because a great deal of the tower condominiums, which have been sold to individual owners, so he no longer is responsible for their taxes. But it just became a very document-intensive story because there were so many pieces of property involved in this tower.
And even after we had the raw data, we had to go crunching it with the, City of Chicago's tax rate for where Trump Tower is located. Then you have to do, some calculations and some math with something called the multiplier, and it just can become there's also differences in how commercial and residential property are valued. Tim probably knows, I think sometimes Tim knows more about property taxes than many of the elected officials who are charged with making these decisions, and he's been a good teacher to me on that stuff. So but this is a classic example of a story where you need to work together, because if you're left doing the math problem yourself, you're always kind of, you can double check it a million times, but this is where we need each other to do the math, and then sometimes we would do the math individually and then check, did you get the same answer I did? And it's an example of why watchdogs tend to work in packs. And
what was the response to the story like, or the outcomes to this particular story when it ran? Was there a response? Was anybody surprised? Did you get comments, emails?
Well, the Cook County assessor wasn't too happy, and we were on TV with his spokesman going back and forth about whether the system is as fair as the public officials say it is. Some journalists have picked up on it. There's actually a story online on the Daily Beast right now that makes references our story. So we'll see. Was it a viral story? No, but
right.
The story like this, we found just a lot of the stories we did on Obama back when he was running the first time. Those stories gradually, they have a long shelf life. on the internet, and people tend to pick them up at odd times. So we'll see what happens with this one.
Understood. So I asked you both about why you think the Chicago Sun-Times devoted such significant resources, especially to David Cashman, but investigative reporting in general is very resource intensive. But I didn't ask you both why you do this kind of work. I mean, Chris, you told the story of knocking on doors of police officers who are not happy that you're there, people who are angry with you on a regular basis, dealing with difficult subjects, very complicated stories, documents, spreadsheets, complicated math. Why do you both do this? Why do you play this role given those dynamics?
I think, you know, Tim told me very early on when we were starting to partner on more stuff that the work we do is important. It matters, and you know, we maybe approach our stories and our subjects a little differently than others do. You know, that Rauner Madigan story you cited, you know, that's kind of an example, I think, of our thinking on things. Everybody in town is writing about how badly these two guys are at odds, and we see it a little differently. We see how, you know, they're both wealthy guys who have shared interests and aren't really affected by a lot of the conundrums they're creating in terms of, you know, failure to fund vital social services for people. I think that's why we do it. I do it personally because I enjoy the people that I work with. I enjoy working with Tim. I enjoy working with our editor, Paul Saltzman. I enjoy the dynamic we have in this room and the freedom to be able to kind of set the agenda, set the news agenda rather than follow it. It's that said, it can be really maddening at times.
I think the bottom line is we live here. This is our home. We're both from here, so we understand how the city works. We understand what does work, what doesn't work, and what works but shouldn't work. We understand the way things work, and we can understand how that is manipulated or that is done to people's advantages. And I think that we do this because we're trying to make the city a better place. I think that's the end result of what it is that we try to do. Whether we succeed or not, we don't really know. But we're just trying to shed light on the things that happen here and how they happen and why.
And you mentioned your editor, Paul Saltzman. I should mention he is featured in a lesson that my organization, the News Literacy Project, did with him about news judgment on our new platform, which is called Checkology. You can find it at checkology.org. Paul's featured there. We also have a lesson taught by James Grimaldi, now at the Wall Street Journal, formerly the Washington Post, about iconic investigative cases. So teachers, students, if you're interested in learning more, you can head to checkology.org and find those there. Another question for Chris and Tim here. What are some areas in today's political landscape that you think the public, especially young people who are joining us today, should watch closely, either for the impact on their lives or to monitor for corruption, maybe something that you feel is underappreciated by citizens?
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. My answer is education. I think education reporting is going to be kind of a big wave of the future. There's so much going on between Tim and I have done stories about the Chicago Teachers Union and how much money it has and the great financial shape it's in. We had a colleague in this room, Dan Hilopoulos, and Tim worked with him early on a bunch of stories about a politically connected charter school network in which money was just siphoned, tax dollars were siphoned away from the public, spent on meals, all kinds of entertainment, crazy stuff, contracts that went to relatives of the board members. You know, I think education reporting is such, I think for years, definitely in Chicago and I think potentially nationally, we've all been focused so much on test scores and programs and the results, and what we've seen in Chicago with the indictment of the school CEO is follow the money. And it's cliche to say that, but when it comes to education, there's a lot of money out there and a lot of contracts, and I think people need to be paying attention to that, like we've paid attention to other branches of government. Education shouldn't get a pass anymore because it's ostensibly touchy-feely, warm, and about the children. It's as much about the money and the contracts as it is about the children.
I think many students probably suffer for that money headed elsewhere and not toward their education, and obviously a lot of students watching live that in their school systems, whether it's here in Chicago, where school funding is a very pressing issue, or elsewhere. Tim, your response here, issues, areas in today's political landscape you think that maybe citizens, and especially young people, should be paying attention to?
Well, I would imagine your viewers would be, I would argue, higher ed, which is just an insatiable beast that keeps growing in terms of costs and the amount of money that is needed to send somebody to college. But I wouldn't limit anything. There's just so many stories that need to be told anywhere, whether it is police corruption or whether it is, government spending on defense or education or whatever, environmental issues. There's issues that are coming out now, lead pipes, and there's more issues than there are people to write about them. We try to find areas that nobody's in. Try to find your own fishing hole where you can find some fish, but there's plenty of fishing holes out there.
We talked earlier about the limitations that some citizens have in terms of understanding how city agencies work, some of the things that you do that take experience, that take insight, that take full-time resources for you to devote, 8-10 hours or sometimes more a day to pursuing information. What are your tips for students and other citizens who want to play a watchdog role of a kind, right? Because citizens can also play a role here. Any parting tips here as we wrap up? Advice you have for students watching? Tools they can use? Ways to settle on an issue? Ways to find a fishing hole, Tim, that you mentioned?
My advice to everyone is always to use your eyes. A lot of the things that we do are based on observations, things we see that aren't right. I saw a truck parked at my house for years, and I finally decided to inquire about a truck. It's a story that probably wouldn't have really happened any other way. When you see things, if you see a road being paved, you can ask, who's doing it? How often has this road been paved? Didn't we just do this last year? People have to think and see, and you can do that in your own backyard.
Why hasn't my road been paved in several years would be the flip side of that. More common here, I think, in Chicago. Chris?
Yeah, I think Tim's right. I mean, I think, curiosity is what drives us, and if you have a curious mind and you're willing to, I think especially with media consolidation, people we're all kind of looking to aggregate each other, and as a result, the news is largely becoming to a certain degree, it's the same story over and over again. And, sometimes you just got to think about it differently. And, Tim had I remember we were talking to some Chinese journalists, and Tim's like, well, I don't look at the flat planter boxes in Chicago and think about how beautiful they are. I look at the planter boxes and think about who planted those flowers, who's watering those flowers, and who's caring for those flowers. And eventually, one time we proved that I think a politically connected group was watering those flowers with ties to Patty Blagojevich and Mayor Daley. So it's just a matter of maybe you don't want to view the world too cynically, but you want to look at it critically, and I think that's curiosity is the way you do that.
Great. So I wanted to make sure to mention we didn't really have any questions from the audience yet, but we are wrapping up here. So this is sort of last call on audience questions before we let Chris and Tim go back to their very busy work there in the newsroom, and we close out here. We are at the top of the hour. So it looks like no questions, but perhaps there'll be some conversation, hopefully, among the audience and follow-up and among folks who watch the archive. So I want to take a moment here to thank both Chris and Tim for taking more than an hour now out of their evening and for putting your thoughts together in preparation for this. We know how busy you are and really appreciate you joining us here tonight. This wraps up the second webinar of this May 2016 series on building news literacy, but please feel free to keep the energy and conversation going on Twitter using the hashtags that I mentioned at the top, both hashtag connected learning and to the numeral 2 next prez with a Z, and we are all on Twitter as well. And there will be a full video recording of this webinar available immediately following on connectedlearning.tv with other curated content on the way. If you found this conversation helpful or interesting or useful, please share the link to the video archive with your networks. And if you'd like to know more about upcoming webinars from Connected Learning TV, which is now produced by the National Writing Project's Educator Innovator, please visit educatorinnovator.org and sign up for their email newsletter. Thanks again, Chris. Thanks again, Tim, National Writing Project, for this evening for a great conversation. And good night. Thank you both.